The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange, as the quiet hum of a new day settled over the neighborhood. The air carried a gentle chill, the kind that made you want to pull your jacket just a little tighter. In one small house at the edge of town, the morning was far from peaceful. A pair of muddy paw prints tracked across the kitchen floor, leading straight to the back door, which was ajar, barely swinging, as though someone, or something, had snuck out in a hurry. Inside the house, a family stood staring at the trail with a mix of disbelief and growing curiosity. Their dog, a scrappy little pup with a knack for mischief, was nowhere to be seen. This wasn't the first time their furry friend had gone off on an unplanned adventure, but something about this morning felt different. There were no sounds of rustling in the yard, no playful barking from the bushes. It was quiet, too quiet. The family exchanged worried glances, each silently wondering the same thing: what could he possibly be up to this time? Their dog wasn't just any ordinary pet. He had a spark of energy, a cleverness that sometimes made them feel he understood more about the world than he let on. Whether it was digging holes in exactly the wrong spot or stealing socks to stash under the couch, he always seemed to have a plan. But this morning, the usual chaos was replaced by an odd absence. As they stepped outside, scanning the yard for any sign of him, the faintest sound reached their ears. It was distant, a high-pitched bark, carried on the breeze from somewhere beyond the familiar fence line. Instinctively, they followed it, hearts thumping with a mix of concern and curiosity. It didn't take long before they realized their adventurous pup was leading them somewhere. The barking grew louder as they crossed into the nearby woods, a place they rarely ventured into. The towering trees and thick brush felt almost alive, whispering secrets as the family carefully navigated the path. The further they went, the more they began to notice things that didn't quite add up: broken branches, small piles of leaves that looked deliberately arranged, and strange marks on the ground, almost like tiny paw-written clues. By now, the family was fully invested in the chase. Each bark seemed like a breadcrumb, guiding them deeper into the unknown. They couldn't shake the feeling that their pup wasn't just running wild, he was calling them for something important. The question was, what? As they pressed on, they stumbled upon an old, weathered sign half buried in the dirt. The letters were barely legible, but they made out enough to feel a shiver run down their spines: keep out. It was clear this was no ordinary walk in the woods. What had started as a simple search for their dog had turned into something far more mysterious. And as they stared at the sign, the barks suddenly stopped, plunging the forest into an eerie silence. They froze, holding their breath, straining to hear any sound. Then, from somewhere just ahead, came the faint rustle of leaves, followed by a low, unmistakable growl. It wasn't their dog, it was something else entirely. What could possibly be waiting for them beyond that sign? And why had their pup brought them here? They had no choice but to move forward. Little did they know, this journey would change everything they thought they knew about their world and their adventurous, mysterious little dog. The growl faded as quickly as it had come, leaving the family standing in tense silence. They exchanged uneasy glances, each of them wondering if they'd imagined it. But the stillness in the air felt heavy, almost oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Something was out there, and it wasn't their dog. The youngest of them, clutching a flashlight despite the growing daylight, whispered, "Should we keep going?" No one answered right away. Their instinct was to turn back, to retreat to the safety of their home, but the thought of leaving their beloved pup out here alone was unbearable. "Let's stick together," one of them finally said, their voice steady but low. With a collective nod, they pressed on, moving cautiously past the old sign. The trees seemed to close in around them, their thick branches creating a canopy that blocked out the sun. Shadows danced across the forest floor, and every rustle of leaves sent their nerves jangling. As they walked, they couldn't help but think about how it all started. Their dog had always been a handful, but he'd also been the heart of their family. Adopted from a shelter a year ago, he'd come into their lives at a time when they needed him most. His boundless energy and mischievous antics had brought joy to their days and pulled them closer together. He had a way of making even the most ordinary moments feel like an adventure. But there had always been something different about him. He was smarter than any dog they'd ever known, often acting as if he understood every word they said. He had a knack for finding things: lost keys, misplaced shoes, even a neighbor's missing cat once. It was almost as though he had a purpose, a secret life they weren't privy to. They joked about it before, laughing at the idea of their pup leading a double life. But now, with every step deeper into the woods, that joke didn't seem so funny anymore. They came upon a clearing, where the dense trees gave way to an open patch of land. In the center stood an old, crumbling stone structure, barely visible beneath a thick layer of moss and ivy. It looked ancient, out of place in the modern world, as though it had been forgotten by time. Their dog's paw prints were faint but unmistakable, leading straight to the structure. "I don't like this," someone murmured, their voice trembling slightly. But no one moved to leave. They were too close now, too invested in finding out what had drawn their dog here. As they approached the structure, a faint sound reached their ears: a whimper. It was unmistakably their pup, but it sounded different. He didn't sound hurt exactly, but there was an urgency in his cries, as if he were calling them closer. They hurried toward the sound, their fear momentarily forgotten in their relief at hearing him again. The closer they got, the more they noticed strange markings etched into the stones. They weren't random scratches, they looked deliberate, almost like symbols. None of them recognized the patterns, but the sight of them sent a chill down their spines. They reached the entrance, a narrow, arched doorway barely wide enough to squeeze through. The whimpering grew louder, echoing from somewhere deep within the structure. "Stay close," someone said as they stepped through the doorway. The air inside was cool and damp, and the faint smell of earth and stone filled their noses. The passageway was narrow and winding, the walls pressing in on them as they moved deeper into the structure. The faint light of their flashlight bounced off the walls, revealing more of the strange markings, carved into every surface. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and there, in the center of the room, was their dog. He was sitting perfectly still, his eyes fixed on them with an intensity that made them stop in their tracks. Relief washed over them at the sight of him, but it was short-lived. He wasn't acting like himself. He wasn't barking or wagging his tail or bounding toward them like he usually did. Instead, he sat as if waiting for something, his ears pricked and his body tense. "Buddy?" one of them called softly, taking a cautious step forward. The dog's gaze flicked to the far side of the room, and for the first time, they noticed it: a small, circular stone pedestal, with something resting on top of it. From this distance, it was hard to tell what it was, but it seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. "What is that?" someone whispered, their voice barely audible. No one answered. They were too focused on the pedestal, drawn to it in a way they couldn't explain. It was as if room itself was pulling them toward it, urging them to uncover its secrets. The dog let out a low, almost impatient bark, breaking the spell. It was as if he was telling them to hurry, to look closer. With hesitant steps, they approached the pedestal, their hearts pounding in unison. As they got closer, the object on the pedestal came into focus: a small, intricately carved artifact that looked like it had been made by hands long gone. It was unlike anything they'd ever seen, its surface covered in the same strange symbols as the walls. One of them reached out to touch it, but before their fingers could make contact, the room seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, and a faint hum filled the space, growing louder with each passing second. The dog barked again, louder this time, as if trying to warn them. "What's happening?" someone shouted, their voice barely audible over the growing noise. But there was no time to answer. The artifact began to glow, its light filling the chamber and spilling into the passageway beyond. The walls seemed to tremble, the symbols flickering as though they were alive. And then, Just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The hum faded, the light dimmed, and the room fell silent once more. The family stood frozen, their breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The artifact was gone. In its place was something none of them could have anticipated: a map, etched into the stone pedestal, its lines glowing faintly in the darkness. Their dog let out a single, sharp bark, his tail wagging slightly for the first time that day. It was as if he was saying, "Now the real journey begins." What they didn't know was that this map would lead them on an adventure unlike anything they'd ever imagined, an adventure that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their world, their family, and their mischievous, extraordinary little dog. The family stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the glowing map etched into the pedestal. It wasn't like anything they'd ever seen. The lines shimmered faintly, weaving intricate paths across the stone's surface, marking what looked like landmarks or destinations. Each glowing point seemed alive, pulsing softly, as if it were waiting for them to act. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to make of it all. Their dog, however, seemed to have no such hesitation. He barked once more, a sharp, insistent sound, before trotting toward the nearest pathway out of the chamber. He paused at the threshold, looking back at them expectantly, his tail wagging slightly. It was clear he wanted them to follow. "What do we do?" one of them asked, their voice barely above a whisper. "We can't just leave this here, can we?" "We don't even know what this is," another replied, their gaze still locked on the map. "But whatever it is, it's like he knows. He brought us here for a reason." Their dog barked again, a little louder this time, his patience wearing thin. It was as though he was saying, "Come on, what are you waiting for?" The family hesitated for only a moment longer before they began to move. The tension in the air was palpable as they followed their dog out of the chamber and back into the winding passageway. The map was burned into their minds. Its glowing lines seemed to hover in their thoughts, as if urging them onward. They didn't have a clear plan or even an idea of where they were going, but something about the whole situation felt bigger than them, bigger than anything they'd ever been part of. The forest outside the structure seemed different now. The air was thicker, the light dimmer, and every sound seemed magnified. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching their every move. The dog led them down a narrow trail that twisted and turned through the trees. The path was uneven, strewn with roots and fallen branches, making every step a cautious one. As they walked, they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Shadows flitted in the corners of their vision, and the rustling of leaves seemed to follow them, even when there was no wind. It was as though the forest was closing in, testing their resolve. Eventually, they came to a small clearing where a stream bubbled gently over smooth stones. The sound of running water was a welcome reprieve from the eerie silence of the woods. But their relief was short-lived. Across the stream, they saw something that stopped them in their tracks. It was another structure, smaller than the one they'd left but no less mysterious. Unlike the crumbling ruin they'd found earlier, this one seemed intact, its dark wooden walls weathered but sturdy. Their dog didn't hesitate. He bounded across the stream, his paws splashing in the shallow water, and stopped just short of the building's entrance. He barked once, sharply, then sat down, waiting for them to catch up. The family exchanged uneasy glances before carefully making their way across the stream. The closer they got, the more they noticed strange carvings etched into the wood, similar to the symbols they'd seen in the first structure. "What is this place?" one of them whispered, their voice tinged with awe and apprehension. Before anyone could answer, the door creaked open on its own. It swung inward slowly, revealing a dimly lit interior. A cold breeze wafted out, carrying with it the faint scent of earth, and something else, something metallic. Their dog was the first to step inside, his movements cautious but confident. The family hesitated at the threshold, their instincts screaming at them to turn back. But the pull of the unknown was too strong, and one by one, they followed their dog inside. The interior of the building was sparse, with walls lined by shelves filled with objects they couldn't immediately identify. There were jars filled with strange substances, books with thick, cracked covers, and odd tools that looked like they belonged in another time. At the center of the room was a table, and on it lay a small object wrapped in cloth. Their dog barked and then growled softly, his gaze fixed on the table. Cautiously, one of them reached out and unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small, metallic disc. It was covered in more of the strange symbols, and as they picked it up, it felt oddly warm to the touch. The symbols on its surface began to glow faintly, just like the map in the chamber. "What is this?" someone asked, their voice shaky. No one had an answer. Before they could ponder further, the air in the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and the light dimmed even more. The shelves rattled, and a low hum filled the space, growing louder with each passing second. The metallic disc began to vibrate in their hands, the glow intensifying. Their dog let out a sharp bark, his ears flattening against his head. He backed toward the door, his body tense, as though he sensed something they couldn't. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and then, with a sudden burst of light, the disc shot a beam of energy toward the far wall. The light illuminated a series of symbols that began to rearrange themselves, forming a pattern they hadn't seen before. And then it stopped. The room fell silent once more, but the tension in the air was thicker than ever. The wall where the beam had hit now displayed what looked like a doorway, faintly glowing with the same energy as the map and the disc. Their dog barked again, louder this time, and ran toward the glowing doorway, his tail wagging furiously. "What's he doing?" someone asked, their voice barely audible over the pounding of their own heart. "He wants us to go through," another replied, their gaze fixed on the doorway. The family stood frozen, torn between fear and the undeniable pull of curiosity. They had come too far to turn back now, but the glowing doorway seemed like a point of no return. What lay beyond it? And why had their dog led them here? The silence stretched, heavy and unbroken, as they stared at the doorway. Their dog barked once more, his tail wagging even faster, as if urging them to hurry. They knew they had a choice to make, one that would change everything. The doorway pulsed faintly, waiting. The air was thick with tension as the family stared at the glowing doorway, its faint pulses drawing their attention like a silent heartbeat. They hesitated, their minds racing with questions they couldn't answer. The strange symbols seemed alive, shifting subtly as though they were watching and waiting for a decision. Their dog barked again, breaking the heavy silence, his sharp sound urging them forward. "What if this is a trap?" one of them whispered, their voice trembling. "But why would he bring us here if it wasn't safe?" Another countered, glancing down at their loyal companion, who now stood with one paw on the glowing threshold, looking back at them expectantly. There was an unspoken trust between them and the dog, a trust that had led them this far. Slowly, one of them stepped forward, the glow reflecting off their uncertain expression. They reached out a hand tentatively toward the doorway, their fingers brushing the edge of the light. It was warm, almost comforting, and seemed to hum softly as if it recognized their touch. They exchanged a glance with the others, silently asking for courage. One by one, the family stepped through the doorway, their movements cautious and deliberate. The moment they crossed the threshold, the world around them shifted. The forest, the strange structure, and even the air seemed to dissolve into a soft, swirling glow. It wasn't like anything they'd ever experienced. It felt both disorienting and oddly serene, as if they were suspended between realities. When the light faded, they found themselves in a vast, open landscape unlike anything they'd ever seen. The ground beneath their feet was smooth and glass-like, reflecting the sky above, which was an endless swirl of colors that seemed to shift and change with every glance. In the distance, towering structures rose up, their shapes fluid and surreal, as if they had been plucked from a dream. The air was filled with a low, melodic hum, and faint trails of light wove through the sky, dancing and weaving like living threads. Their dog trotted ahead, his tail wagging as if he belonged here. He paused to sniff at the air before turning back to look at them, his expression almost reassuring. Whatever this place was, it seemed to welcome him. But for the family, the overwhelming strangeness of it all was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. "What is this place?" someone finally asked, their voice barely above a whisper. No one had an answer. They moved cautiously, their steps echoing faintly on the strange, reflective surface. The dog led them forward, his pace steady and determined, as if he knew exactly where they needed to go. They followed him, their eyes darting around as they took in the surreal landscape. Every step seemed to draw them deeper into the unknown, and the sense of being watched grew stronger with each passing moment. As they walked, they began to notice faint shapes in the distance, figures that seemed to flicker in and out of view, like mirages on the horizon. The closer they got, the more defined these figures became. They weren't human, but they weren't entirely alien either. Their forms shimmered with the same glowing energy as the symbols in the doorway, and their movements were fluid and graceful, almost otherworldly. The figures didn't seem threatening, but their presence was unnerving. The dog barked once, breaking the tension, and the figures turned toward the sound. For a long moment, they simply stared, their glowing eyes fixed on the family. Then, one of them stepped forward, its movements deliberate but unhurried. It raised a hand, and the air seemed to shimmer around it. The dog barked again, this time softer, as if in greeting. The figure paused, tilting its head slightly as though it were considering something. Then, without a word, it pointed to the horizon, where a massive structure loomed in the distance. It was unlike anything they'd seen so far, its towering spires reaching into the swirling sky. The figure lowered its hand and stepped back, blending once more into the faint shapes of its companions. The family exchanged uneasy glances but knew they had little choice. The dog seemed undeterred, trotting ahead toward the distant structure with a confidence that was both reassuring and baffling. They followed, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty landscape. As they approached the towering structure, the air grew heavier, and the melodic hum that had surrounded them since they arrived grew louder, more intense. The structure itself seemed alive, its surface shifting and rippling like liquid metal. Strange symbols covered its walls, glowing faintly as they had seen before. At its base was an opening, dark and foreboding, but their dog headed straight for it without hesitation. The family paused at the entrance, the weight of their journey pressing down on them. They could feel the pull of the unknown, stronger now than ever before. Their dog barked once, his voice echoing into the depths of the structure. It was a call to action, a reminder that they had come too far to turn back. Taking a deep breath, they stepped inside. The air was cooler here, and the faint hum seemed to resonate through their bodies. The interior was vast and open, with walls that seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction. In the center of the space was a massive pedestal, similar to the one they had seen in the forest but far grander in scale. It pulsed with energy, its light casting long, flickering shadows. As they approached, the pedestal began to glow brighter, its surface shifting to reveal a new map. But this one was different. It didn't show a single path or destination, it showed countless possibilities, branching out like the roots of a great tree. The symbols on the map began to rearrange themselves, forming shapes and patterns that seemed to speak directly to their minds. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and the light from the pedestal intensified. The symbols began to move faster, their glow growing brighter and brighter until it was almost blinding. The family shielded their eyes, their hearts pounding as the air around them seemed to vibrate with energy. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. The light dimmed, and the trembling stopped. The pedestal now displayed a single, glowing symbol, its meaning unclear but its significance undeniable. Their dog barked softly, his tail wagging as he looked up at them, his eyes filled with an almost human understanding. The family stared at the symbol, their minds racing with questions. What did it mean? What were they supposed to do next? And why had their dog brought them here? The answers felt tantalizingly close, yet just out of reach. They could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that they were on the brink of something extraordinary. But before they could act, the air around them shifted once more. The hum grew louder, and the space seemed to ripple and distort. They could feel the presence of something vast and powerful, something that had been watching them all along. The tension was unbearable, and every instinct told them that the climax of their journey was near. The hum grew louder still, a deep resonance that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. The family huddled closer together, their eyes darting around the shimmering space. Something was coming, they could feel it, an undeniable presence drawing nearer. Their dog stood firm, his ears perked and his gaze fixed on the pedestal, as if he were bracing for what was to come. Without warning, the glowing symbol on the pedestal began to shift and expand, unraveling like a thread being pulled from fabric. The light twisted and coiled in the air, forming a shape that was at once mesmerizing and menacing. The swirling energy solidified into what appeared to be a portal, its edges crackling with raw, untamed power. Through the opening, they caught glimpses of a dark, chaotic world, a place that seemed to defy all logic and reason. Just as they were beginning to process what they were seeing, a figure emerged from the portal. Unlike the ethereal beings they had encountered earlier, this one was solid, imposing, and undeniably real. Its form was cloaked in shadows, but its eyes burned with a piercing light that seemed to see straight through them. The air grew colder, and an almost palpable sense of dread settled over the room. The figure stepped forward, its movements deliberate and unnervingly fluid. "You have come far," it said, its voice echoing like a distant storm. "But you are trespassers in a place you do not understand." The family froze, their fear rendering them speechless. The dog, however, let out a low growl, standing protectively in front of them. The figure's gaze shifted to the dog, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in its expression, recognition, perhaps, or even respect. "This creature," the figure said, its tone softening slightly, "knows more than you realize. He is bound to this place in ways you cannot yet comprehend." It gestured toward the portal, its shadowy hand leaving trails of light in the air. "The choice you face is not one to be taken lightly. Beyond this threshold lies a truth that will change you forever." The family exchanged uneasy glances, their minds racing. They had come so far, driven by their dog's unwavering determination and their own growing curiosity. But the figure's words had introduced a new layer of uncertainty. What truth awaited them beyond the portal? And could they trust this enigmatic being? As if sensing their hesitation, the figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. "There is no turning back," it said, its voice low and commanding. "You have been chosen, whether you like it or not. The paths you see before you are illusions. There is only one way forward." The pedestal began to glow brighter, its symbols rearranging themselves once again. This time, they formed a map, similar to the one they had seen earlier but with far more detail. The map showed two distinct paths, one leading into the chaotic world beyond the portal, and the other spiraling back into darkness. The choice was clear, but the implications were not. Their dog barked sharply, breaking the heavy silence. He looked up at them, his eyes filled with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. It was as if he were trying to tell them something, to communicate in a language they couldn't quite understand. The family hesitated, their fear warring with their trust in their loyal companion. Before they could decide, the figure raised its hand, and the portal began to shift and change. The chaotic world beyond seemed to calm, its swirling darkness giving way to faint glimmers of light. For a brief moment, they caught a glimpse of something beautiful, a lush, vibrant landscape filled with shimmering rivers and towering trees. But just as quickly as it appeared, the vision was swallowed by darkness once more. "The choice is yours," the figure said, its voice heavy with finality. "But know this, every decision has its cost." The family stood frozen, their minds reeling. The stakes had never been higher, and the weight of the moment was almost unbearable. Their dog barked again, his voice filled with determination. He stepped closer to the portal, his movements confident and unyielding. It was clear where he thought they should go. But just as they were about to follow, a second shockwave rippled through the space, knocking them off balance. The pedestal's light flickered, and the symbols began to rearrange themselves in a chaotic frenzy. The figure stepped back, its gaze fixed on the portal with an intensity that sent a chill down their spines. Something was coming. Something far more dangerous than the figure or the choices they faced. The portal's edges crackled with energy, and the hum grew into a deafening roar. The family clung to each other, their fear mounting as the space around them began to distort and fracture. Their dog barked wildly, his stance protective but his fear evident. The figure turned to them, its expression grim. "You must decide now," it shouted, its voice barely audible over the rising cacophony. "The balance is breaking, and time is running out." But before they could respond, the portal exploded with light, and a new presence emerged. This one was even more formidable, its form cloaked in a swirling mist that seemed to absorb the very light around it. Its voice was a low, resonant growl that sent shivers down their spines. "You dare to interfere?" The new figure hissed, its gaze locked on the shadowy being. "This is not your domain." The two figures squared off, their confrontation crackling with tension. The family watched in stunned silence, their fear mingled with a strange sense of awe. Whatever was happening, it was far beyond their comprehension. And yet, amidst chaos, their dog stepped forward. His movements were steady and deliberate, his focus unwavering. He stood between the two figures, his presence somehow calming the storm of energy around them. For a brief moment, everything seemed to pause, the tension hanging in the air like a fragile thread. But the peace was short-lived. The misty figure let out a roar, its form expanding and shifting as it prepared to strike. The shadowy figure raised its hand, its energy crackling with power. The family could only watch, their hearts pounding as battle began to unfold before them. The stakes had never been higher, and the choices they faced were more daunting than ever. Every moment brought them closer to a decision that would change their lives forever. But as the battle raged on, one thing became clear: their dog was more than just a companion. He was the key to everything. The clash between the two figures erupted in a burst of energy so intense that it felt like the world itself was being torn apart. The family shielded their eyes, overwhelmed by the blinding light and the deafening sound of the battle unfolding before them. Their dog, however, stood firm, his eyes fixed on the chaos with an almost supernatural calm. It was as if he knew something they didn't, as if he were waiting for the perfect moment to act. The shadowy figure and the misty being circled each other, their powers colliding in waves that rippled through the air. The room trembled, the pedestal flickering with unstable energy as the symbols scrambled in a chaotic dance. The family clung to each other, their fear palpable, yet they couldn't tear their eyes away. They were witnesses to something far beyond their understanding, something ancient and powerful. Suddenly, the shadowy figure faltered. The misty being seized the opportunity, lunging forward with a surge of energy that sent the other figure crashing to the ground. The impact shook the room, and for a moment, it seemed as though the battle was over. The misty figure turned its attention to the family, its gaze cold and unyielding. "You were never meant to be here," it said, its voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. "This place is not for you. Leave now, or face the consequences." The family froze, unsure of what to do. Their dog barked sharply, breaking the tense silence. He stepped forward, his posture defiant as he placed himself between the misty being and his family. The misty figure regarded him with a mixture of annoyance and intrigue. "You creature," it said, its tone shifting. "You are not what you seem. Why do you interfere?" The dog didn't back down. Instead, he let out a deep, resonant bark that seemed to reverberate through the room. The misty figure hesitated, its form flickering as if destabilized by the sound. The shadowy figure, still on the ground, seized the moment to rise, its energy crackling with renewed strength. "It is not over," the shadowy figure said, its voice low but resolute. "You underestimate the bond they share." The misty being turned back to face its opponent, but the dog leaped into action. With a sudden burst of speed, he charged toward the pedestal, his movements purposeful and precise. The family shouted in alarm, but he ignored them, his focus unwavering. He reached the pedestal and pressed his paw against the center symbol. The entire room lit up with a blinding light, and the symbols stopped their frantic rearranging. The light expanded, engulfing everything in its path. The two figures cried out, their forms dissolving into the brightness. The family felt a rush of warmth and energy, as if they were being enveloped by something protective and pure. For a moment, there was nothing but light, no sound, no movement, no fear. When the light faded, they found themselves back in their own living room. The pedestal, the portal, and the figures were gone, as if they had never existed. The room was quiet, the only sound the steady breathing of their dog as he sat calmly at their feet. The family looked around, their hearts still racing from the ordeal. "What just happened?" one of them whispered, their voice trembling. Their dog looked up at them, his eyes filled with a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. He wagged his tail gently, as if to reassure them that everything was okay. But there was something else in his gaze, something deeper, almost knowing. Before they could process what had happened, a faint glow caught their attention. They looked down to see a small, shimmering symbol etched into the floor where the pedestal had been. It was the same symbol their dog had activated, and it pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic light. The family exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what it meant. Their dog stood up and walked over to the symbol, sitting beside it with an air of quiet confidence. It was clear that whatever had happened, their journey wasn't truly over. The symbol was a reminder, a clue, or perhaps a key to something even greater. As they stared at the glowing mark, a realization began to dawn on them. Their dog hadn't just been leading them on an adventure, he had been protecting them, guiding them through something far beyond their comprehension. And now, it seemed, he was preparing them for what lay ahead. The family couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had been irrevocably changed. The bond they shared with their dog had deepened in ways they couldn't fully understand, and the mysteries they had uncovered were only the beginning. As they sat together, their hearts still pounding from the intensity of the experience, one thing was certain: their journey was far from over. Just as they began to settle into the quiet of the moment, their dog let out a soft bark. They turned to look at him, and for a brief instant, they thought they saw the faintest shimmer of light in his eyes. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but it left them with a sense of wonder and a lingering question that would keep them awake for many nights to come. What secrets was their loyal companion still keeping? And where would he lead them next? The family sat in the stillness of their living room, the glowing symbol on the floor casting a soft, rhythmic light that felt almost like a heartbeat. Their dog remained by the mark, his tail wagging slowly, his posture calm but alert. The tension of the moment had eased, replaced by a quiet awe that none of them could quite put into words. One of them finally broke the silence. "Do you think it's over?" The question hung in the air, met with uncertain glances. It was hard to believe that something so extraordinary could end so suddenly, and leave them back in the ordinary comfort of their home. Yet the glowing symbol on the floor seemed to suggest otherwise. Their dog let out a small, encouraging bark, his eyes fixed on them with a look that was both reassuring and expectant. It was as though he wanted them to know that everything was all right, but that their journey, while paused, might not truly be over. The family decided to inspect the symbol more closely. They crouched around it, noticing how the intricate patterns seemed to shift and move under their gaze. It was beautiful in a way that defied explanation, almost alive. Despite its otherworldly appearance, it didn't feel threatening. If anything, it seemed to hum with a sense of purpose. As they pondered its meaning, the youngest member of the family reached out hesitantly to touch the mark. The moment their fingers brushed the surface, the glow brightened momentarily before fading entirely, leaving behind nothing but the faintest outline of the symbol etched into the wood. The family looked at each other, unsure of what had just happened, but their dog's wagging tail reassured them. Whatever the mark represented, it seemed to have done what it was meant to do. Life began to return to normal in the days that followed, though the family couldn't shake the feeling that they had been part of something extraordinary. Their dog, too, seemed changed. He was the same loyal and playful companion as always, but there was a new depth to his behavior, a quiet confidence that made them wonder how much he truly understood about what had happened. The family talked often about their experience, trying to piece together the events and what they might mean. They shared theories and memories, each adding their perspective to the puzzle. While they didn't have all the answers, one thing was clear: the bond between them and their dog had grown stronger than ever. They trusted him implicitly, knowing that he had not only guided them through something incredible but also protected them at every turn. Weeks turned into months, and the memory of that night began to feel like a distant dream. But every now and then, something would happen to remind them. A faint glow would appear in the corner of their eyes, only to vanish when they turned to look. Their dog would stop and stare at seemingly nothing, his ears perked and his tail still, as though he sensed something just out of reach. These moments were fleeting but enough to keep the family's curiosity alive. One evening, as they were sitting together in the living room, their dog suddenly stood up and walked to the spot where the symbol had once glowed. He barked softly, a sound that carried a sense of urgency. The family exchanged knowing glances. It wasn't fear they felt this time, but anticipation. Whatever their dog had to show them, they were ready. They followed him outside, where the air was crisp and the stars shone brightly overhead. He led them to the edge of the woods behind their house, a familiar yet somehow different place in the moonlight. The family hesitated, but their dog looked back at them, his eyes filled with trust and determination. They took a deep breath and stepped into the trees. The path was faint, illuminated only by the silvery light of the moon and the occasional flicker of fireflies. Their dog moved with purpose, leading them deeper into the woods until they reached a small clearing. In the center stood a single stone pillar, its surface smooth and unmarked except for a faintly glowing symbol at its base, the same symbol that had appeared in their living room. The family approached cautiously, their hearts pounding with a mixture of excitement and unease. Their dog sat down beside the pillar, his tail wagging gently as he looked up at them. It was clear that this was where he had meant to bring them, but the reason remained a mystery. One of them reached out to touch the glowing mark, and as their fingers made contact, the air around them seemed to shift. The clearing grew brighter, the stars above shimmering like they were part of some grand design. A soft hum filled the air, resonating deep within their chests. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the light dimmed, and the hum faded. The family looked around, unsure of what had just happened. But their dog seemed content, his tail wagging happily as he stood and began to lead them back home. In the days that followed, they noticed subtle changes in their lives. Things seemed to fall into place more easily. Problems that once felt insurmountable now had clear solutions. They found themselves more attuned to each other, their bond as a family stronger than ever. It was as though the journey they had taken had left them with something intangible, but profoundly meaningful. Their dog continued to be a constant source of joy and comfort, his role in their lives more significant than ever. They often wondered what he had seen or understood that they hadn't, but they were content to let the mystery remain. After all, some questions didn't need answers to be meaningful. As time went on, the events of that extraordinary night became a cherished memory, a story they told around the table on quiet evenings. It was a reminder of the incredible journey their dog had taken them on and the unbreakable bond they shared. And while the glowing symbol and the stone pillar remained part of the mystery, the family knew one thing for certain: their dog had been more than just a guide. He had been their protector, their teacher, and their greatest friend. Whatever adventures lay ahead, they were ready to face them together, knowing that their bond would carry them through anything. In the end, it wasn't the answers that mattered but the journey itself and the love that had grown stronger because of it. Their dog, with his wagging tail and knowing eyes, had shown them that sometimes, the greatest adventures come not from seeking the unknown but from embracing the connections that make us who we are.